I'm not really sure how to start this video. What I'd like to do is to do 2 or 3 or maybe as many as 4 videos that focus on Brook Ziporyn, who I've already done some things on him, like his dolphin school and his milk medicine treatises relative to Tiantai Buddhism. But in this particular instance, or in these instances, I want to focus some on his book called Being and Ambiguity. And he gets into here what he subtitles it as Philosophical Experiments with Tiantai Buddhism. And he gets into various philosophical traditions. He's a tremendously erudite, brilliant guy, really. And some of his ways of describing, particularly in terms of my interests, aspects of how we can interpret the Lotus Sutra are fascinating to me. Now, I want to give the caveat here, or the preamble commentary of my own, to the effect that I am a Shin Buddhist. I'm a true Pure Land Buddhist. I take refuge in Amida Buddha. That is the source of my comfort. That is the source of my way of thinking and conceptualizing, given that we as human beings have to have some way of conceptualizing. But what Ziporyn does is take us on a journey of perhaps a deeper, more philosophically intricate way of viewing the Dharma that some of you may find fascinating. And so, let me just go for it here. And to use part of the subtitle of his section of this particular volume, I'll call this video and refer to it as The Process of Transformative Recontextualization. And I'll try to give a few comments along the way to sort of unpack what I think he's trying to say, which, again, I may be totally off base. And he's referring to interpretations of Tiantai Buddhism that, again, I would leave it to others to weigh in terms of whether this is a conventional and appropriate and accurate way of characterizing Tiantai, or whether it's idiosyncratic in some sense. But I do think that he's making a tremendous effort here to help us understand, but again, in his way of pretty intellectualized verbiage, if you will. So what he's saying is that the Tiantai view of the purported Lotus Sutra teaching is of opening the provisional to reveal the real as the ultimate truth revealed by all teachings. And of course, the word purported is, again, there's confusion and maybe disagreement about what is the Lotus trying to teach. I've always just, sort of emphasized it at in some ways, more superficial level of the chapter 2 teaching of upaya, or expedient means, or skillful means, and then chapter 16 regarding the eternal life of the Buddha. But the Lotus Sutra draws one in. I've said this more than once. And, what is it that draws us in? And it is perhaps this deeper, more profound kind of meaning that resonates with us in the depths of our being, or in relation to our own Buddha nature. So the sutra teaching the opening of the provisional to reveal the real, and again, this is at a relatively superficial level, the provisional teaching of the 3-vehicle doctrine relative to what he teaches in the second chapter, being the one Buddha vehicle, or the one vehicle, the Buddha way, that all of us are on the path to become Buddhas, and we all will in the future become Buddhas. Is the prophecy that he gives to the Shravakas and to the Pratyeka Buddhas, and of course, in turn to the reader, which is you and I, who are going through this Lotus Sutra and being drawn into it. So Ziporyn says, the Lotus, a text with minimal doctrinal content, which it does have minimal content. It makes reference to emptiness. It makes reference in the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, which is sort of the preamble or the preface of the threefold Lotus Sutra, to the fundamental principle of formlessness from which the various doctrines and teachings flow. But again, it's not heavy on doctrine per se. Its form is more in a context of parables that carry these teachings that Ziporyn is going to try to explain at a deeper level. So the Lotus, a text with minimal doctrinal content, except for a meta-level consideration of the relationship between different teachings, namely, again, the three vehicles versus the one vehicle, for example, is, in the Tiantai view, the ultimate truth. The Lotus Sutra is the ultimate truth. And Tiantai, again, being that school of Buddhism that crystallized in China, that really focused on the lotus and that articulated the threefold truth, namely the conventional truth, the ultimate truth or emptiness, and then the middle, which is the simultaneous experience of both the conventional and the ultimate or the transcendental. So it, being the lotus, is not some specific teaching about what the real is, but just the act of opening and revealing, of bringing teachings together so that they are revealed to be versions of one another. One may say of teaching per se, that is the ultimate teaching. And he uses the term here, omnicentrism. He says omnicentrism is here viewed not as one specific teaching among many, but as the real significance of what it means for there to be any teaching at all. Omnicentrism meaning that no given teaching, and at another level, no particular thing is like the center from which everything else can be judged. So again, he's saying, omnicentrism is here viewed not as one specific teaching among many, but as the real significance of what it means for there to be any teaching at all. What is really at stake when anyone suggests any center, any way of interpreting experience. So all viewpoints, all teachings, in a sense, are from a certain perspective, but that perspective can be altered as a function of looking at them from another perspective. This hinges on the work done by, and this is his term, Inter-sumption. I think it's his term, which is a term that he, I think, in parenthesis, calls all-pervasiveness, which is reminiscent of what my crude and superficial understanding is of the Avatamsaka or Flower Garland Sutra, of the interpenetratedness of all dharmas or things. So Inter-sumption, he says, this notion of omnicentrism hinges on the work done by inter-sumption, which he reminds us is just another concept. Again, all concepts are merely finger pointing at the moon, not the moon itself, not reality with a capital R, which we can't characterize with any concepts, words, theories, or whatever. So this inter-sumption, seeing that all things are reducible to anything, all things are reducible to this thing. Its specific character is to make it possible for everything to also be reducible to anything else. It is established as the absolute truth above all other truths. It simultaneously establishes every other possible thing, sensation, or concept as the absolute truth. So no given thing, no given theory, no given teaching can be considered absolutely true only from its own perspective without taking into account the fact that we're merely looking at it from that perspective and that there are other perspectives from which some other thing or concept or teaching might be seen as absolutely true. And again, neither of those premises are correct according to Ziporyn's interpretation. This is how inter-sumption transformatively recontextualizes all other, what he calls, coherences, how it opens up the provisional to reveal the real. So this, I think this is a neat concept of recontextualizing. In other words, looking at something from a different in a different context from which we might originally be viewing it. And, he's then relating this to the Lotus Sutra teaching of opening up the provisional to reveal the real, which in a broader sense, beyond the Lotus itself, is the fundamental Tiantai teaching of how reality in general is characterized, not just in the context of different Buddhist traditions or teachings. in terms of coherences, recontextualizes all the other coherences. I'm not sure I can give you an exact definition of what he talks about by coherences, but maybe as you hear, no pun intended, the contexts in which he uses it, you'll get a little better feel for what a coherence is. I think it's like a thing in a particular instance. A thing or a teaching in a particular instance or in a general instance. The Tiantai tradition's unique position rests on its claim concerning the relation that obtains between local coherence and global incoherence. Now, again, I'm not going to be able to pin that down for you precisely, but you can see from those of you who are familiar with the teaching in the Lotus that, the local coherence presumably would be, for example, in that case, the three-vehicle teaching, the global incoherence being the broader one-vehicle teaching. So these two things, the local coherence and global incoherence, if you want to think of it as the three-vehicle versus the one-vehicle, they turn out to be, quote, neither the same nor different. And this is the key to this whole thing, in a sense, denoted here as the non-exclusive center. And again, omnicentrism. Neither of these can be viewed as, this one's inferior, this one's superior, this one has value, this one doesn't. This one is the perspective from which we should view truth versus the other one. But rather than relegating this claim to a facile, unthinkable identity of contraries or blank everything is everything story, which is kind of what that would lead to, the Tiantai tradition has something very specific in mind here. And take my word for it, we will get into a little more of a concrete perspective in talking about the Lotus as he goes on in these couple of pages. He says, the neither sameness nor difference of the provisional and global incoherence in Inter-sumption is to be understood on the model of the relation between provisional and ultimate doctrines preached by the Buddha. And here we get into a little more familiar territory. The process of preaching false but necessary provisional doctrines, like the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, on the basis of one's realization of ultimate truth, that the Buddha way is the path that all beings eventually will tread in order to become Buddhas, okay? So let me just read that again in toto. The model of the relation between provisional and ultimate doctrines preached by the Buddha, the process of preaching false but necessary provisional doctrines on the basis of one's realization of ultimate truth in order to lead other beings to that ultimate truth, especially as described in the Lotus. So in the context of the Lotus, the one Buddha vehicle is the ultimate truth, whereas the Shravaka vehicle is the provisional. The ontological problems, and I want to give a definition of ontological here that I looked up. First of all, metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that examines the fundamental nature of reality, okay? And ontological is a branch of metaphysics. It's the branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being. So he's saying the ontological problems of the relation of appearance and reality and of oneness to multiplicity are to be understood here according to the blueprint provided by this basic paradigm. That is, local coherence is to global incoherence as provisional truth is to ultimate truth. And he asks, what precisely is this relation? Okay. According to the Lotus, the provisional doctrines, valid in some local context, are posited, number one, on the basis of the ultimate truth, and number two, in order to reveal the ultimate truth. That is, to put it in the technical terms of traditional Buddhist mythology, a Buddha creates these doctrines on the basis of his own wisdom and compassion, his own embodiment of ultimate truth, and designs them for the sole purpose of leading other sentient beings to the same state. The doctrines, understood in the sense specified by their original local context, do not literally describe this state of realization or match its contents, but do both derive from and lead to it. However, this is not yet the whole story, for according to the Tiantai understanding of this relation in terms of opening the provisional to reveal the real, this content is itself purely context-dependent. And this is where we get into the aspect that I'm tempted to say is harder to grasp than it, but then again, within Mahayana Buddhism, that we don't want a mind that grasps anything. But here you go. Let's try to grasp this for starters. Here is the Tiantai understanding of this relation between the provisional and the real, is that this content is itself purely context dependent. That is, just the same content when opened up and revealed in this context of deriving from and leading to ultimate truth, suddenly reads differently, without having changed in the least. It is not that the provisional is refuted and replaced by ultimate truth, but that it is revealed in this manner to have always been, token for token, ultimate truth itself. Okay, let that settle in for a second, and then let's go on. On this picture, it is possible to be practicing both ultimate and provisional truths at the same time, in that one may believe himself to be practicing a particular practice, Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, which, when recontextualized, turns out to have always had quite a different meaning and efficacy. Hence, in the Lotus, the Shravakas, or Hinayana disciples, are told that they have actually been practicing the Bodhisattva path all along. As are the tormentors of the Bodhisattva, never disparage. And for those of you who may not be able to recall, in chapter 20 of the Lotus Sutra, we hear the story of a Bodhisattva named Never Despise, and whenever he encounters a layman or cleric, he approached them, bowed down to them, and said aloud, "I dare not look on you because you will become a Buddha in the future." And this declaration angered some persons who would insult and beat him. In response, Never Despise would simply run far away and repeat, "I dare not look down on you because you will become a Buddha." So the story of his conviction and expression verbally of the fact that from his perspective, all these persons, even though they were disparaging him and abusing him, that they all would become Buddhas, represents this prediction that's embedded throughout many of the parables in the Lotus Sutra. And Ziyi, or Chi, the founder of Tiantai Buddhism, points out that these tormentors are not instructed to change their behavior in any way. Rather, they are told that in doing what they are doing, namely tormenting Never Disparage, they are now actually practicing the Bodhisattva path, which proceeds from and leads to enlightenment. Okay. Because they are doing that, of course, they will all become Buddhas. This claim is made possible by the presumption that the Bodhisattva path is a particular state of being which is understood as having at least the following two attributes. Number one, it can assume any form, because it is, number two, always involved in responding to and bringing enlightenment to other sentient beings. Hence, any particular form may turn out to be, and I'm not going to be able to define this word for you particularly, any particular form may turn out to be an instantiation of the Bodhisattva path, or an example of the Bodhisattva path, and have the effect of bringing enlightenment to both oneself and others. The previous teachings are shown to have been provisional, merely forms of bodhisattvahood, and their real intention and source is revealed. They are forms of bodhisattvahood. They were not literally true as understood in the original context, but when placed in the context of the original intention and result, both of which are the bodhisattva path, a beginning before the previous supposed beginning and an end after the previous supposed end, it is revealed that these very teachings, token for token, were revelations of the ultimate truth as well, That is, they were forms assumed by enlightenment, and which reveal enlightenment. Now, when a previous teaching is, quote, opened up in this way, it is not exactly refuted. Instead, the hermeneutic context in which it reveals itself to have always been speaking the ultimate truth is revealed. Now I had to look that one up. Hermeneutic, a method or theory of interpretation. So the method or theory of interpretation of this dynamic and of this context in which it reveals itself to have always been speaking the ultimate truth is revealed by virtue of this teaching, in particular the Tiantai interpretation of this teaching. The point being that the teaching itself is not changed, but now it is seen that all along it was teaching the ultimate truth, the content and implications of which are very different from those assumed to pertain when this provisional teaching was heard in isolation, or taken in its literal sense. Okay? As he says, quote, when we open up the upayas, or the expedient means, the skillful means, when we open up the upayas to reveal the real ultimate truth in them, we see that precisely the former bodies of Buddhas preaching inferior doctrines are the perfect eternal body, and that the former doctrines are all the perfect integrated teaching, that the former practices and former principles are all precisely the ultimate real, close quote. So that is Zi or Chi, direct from his mouth. So that has to be, I think, doctrinally sound in terms of Tiantai Buddhism, and expresses what Ziporyn is trying to get across through his more elaborated verbiage and explanation. Now, just to go on a little bit further, that this entails also that once the ultimate is revealed, it reveals itself both in contrast to the previous upayas and as a new contextual nexus, in the light of which the former teachings are themselves revealed as identical to this ultimate teaching. So they're both upayas, if you will. In some sense, everything is an expedient mean or a provisional teaching to lead to an ultimate truth. And depending on what direction you're looking from or looking in, one may be provisional, one may be ultimate, one may open to reveal the real, or the other may open to reveal the real. If I'm not misinterpreting this way of recontextualizing. Okay, this is made most explicit in the Tiantai doctrine of the two marvels, the relative and the absolute, which is traditionally explained with respect to the relative status of various sutras. But this is the model for Tiantai vision of reality. So what's being taught in the Lotus Sutra relative to the different Buddhist traditions or teachings, as well as relative to different sutras, such as when it talks about the Lotus Sutra being the supreme of all the sutras, actually, according to the Tiantai interpretation, is again a commentary on the nature of reality itself. Okay? And Ziporyn says, let us draw the implications, and this may be a little clearer as he ties in back with some of the parables in the Lotus. Both the distinction between value and anti-value and the subsequent abolition of that distinction are necessary here. Value and anti-value. Nirvana, samsara. By means of the distinction between delusion and enlightenment, for example, by means of the distinction, the concept of value is gained. Enlightenment, ooh, that's great. Without first having the contrast, there would be no notion of what was meant by value. Moreover, this alone assures that value will be able to perform its work of transforming anti-value into itself. So by seeking enlightenment, by trying to attain, quote unquote, is the process by which we gain the insight, that there's a sameness there, a not same, but also a sameness between these apparently divergent or antithetical kinds of experiences or notions. So again, having this contrast assures that value will be able to perform its work of transforming anti-value into itself. Once this concept is in hand and granted its place hierarchically above anti-value, of course, enlightenment is better than delusion and ignorance, with which it is given meaning by contrast, big contrast, it is revealed that this value subsumes anti-value within it, that by virtue of itself, anti-value is no longer anti-value, which basically here we're, I think, talking about non-duality, but rather it is, paradoxically, value itself. So anti-value is value itself. This can serve as a template not only for the revelation between the Lotus and other sutras, but also for the development of the Mahayana claims of identity between nirvana and samsara. We begin with suffering, deluded beings which have always existed. The Buddha comes along and says, notice that you are suffering and deluded, that all reality is nothing but delusion and suffering. By grasping those concepts, they simultaneously grasp the contrasting opposite concepts, enlightenment and bliss, defined so far only as far-off ideals, contrasting in every detail with reality, namely nirvana. Nirvana is so far quite simply the pure opposite of reality, its unmitigated negation. Reality is impermanent, painful, selfless or unfree, and defiled. Therefore, nirvana means the opposite state. The state is permanent, blissful, free and pure. Nirvana, defined in this way, is the relative marvel. Then comes the twist. This further revelation is made that existing reality is nirvana. Nirvana is samsara. In other words, nirvana is the ordinary cycle of birth and death itself. It is reality that possesses these qualities of permanence, bliss, and so on, precisely by virtue of the impermanence and pain that led to their positing. Value consists in revealing that the anti-value with which it was contrasted in order to become defined is itself the source and locus of this value, is itself identical to value. To say from the beginning, this is all value, would have no meaning at all, would not reveal anything to sentient beings, because they simply would not know what the value or marvel means. As Z.E. says, quote, how could the coarse thinkable be different from the marvelous unthinkable? Without leaving words and letters, we can thus speak the meaning of liberation. The crux is just to realize how the thinkable is identical to the unthinkable, close quote. This notion of opening and revealing does not only apply to doctrines and teachings, much less merely to the groupings of the Buddha's teachings, although this is its initial and formative point of reference, such as in the Lotus Sutra. It is deployed as general metaphysical notion. This entails not only an emphasis on the preservation of individual deluded forms and even names in their glorified form, but also the way in which the actual qualities, appearances, characteristics, that is, all forms of existence other than Buddhahood, are treated as a kind of upaya, or skillful means of teaching, which are opened up and revealed to be the Buddha realm. By this very act, they are all again both provisional and real at the same time. The relation between the provisional and ultimate teachings is here used as a model for the relation between the ontic realms themselves. Ontic, ontological, the nature of being, the nature of reality, the nature of reality itself. Ordinary reality is to the realm of enlightenment as a provisional teaching is to the ultimate teaching that it leads to. Now, I'll just close this video with an analogy that Ziporyn makes and really references at different times throughout this particular volume, where he compares this dynamic to the dynamic of a joke. and where he says, the entire Tiantai concept of the relation between provisional and ultimate truth can be illuminated by means of a very commonplace example, namely the structure of a joke. Provisional is to ultimate as a setup is to punchline. Enlightenment is here equal to humorousness, delusion to seriousness. The whole setup of the joke is experienced as serious until the punchline appears. Once the punchline is understood, however, the entire setup is seen to have also been funny. One does not say, after all, the punchline is funny, but the joke as a whole is not. One simply says that the whole joke is funny, including the seriousness of the setup. Every atom of the setup is thereby understood to have also been funny. But this does not mean that one was laughing while hearing the setup. On the contrary, the punchline will only be experienced as funny if the setup has been temporarily or provisionally taken seriously. It is precisely the contrast between the solemnity of the setup and the absurdity of the punchline that constitutes the humor of the latter, and thereby of the entire joke, including the serious setup. In this way, we can see how the setup can be simultaneously serious and funny, and how these two are identical to one another, and yet exist in a necessary conflict and contrast. So, there you have it. Brook Ziporyn helping us to understand what his interpretation is of the teaching of Tiantai Buddhism. And he gives in a footnote here more detail regarding Z or Chi's perspective, where G says, each Dharma realm possesses 10 thusnesses, so the 10 have a total of 100. But since each inherently includes the other 9, each has 100 Dharma realms with a total of 1,000 thusnesses. Now how can these be arranged into 5 levels? 1, the evil. 2, the good. 3, the 2 vehicles. 4, the bodhisattvas. 5, the Buddhas. If we divide these into, we can say that the first 4 are provisional, and the last one is the real. But a more detailed exposition reveals that each one possesses both the provisional and the real. So, one of the bottom line implications of this is, the world is thus to be experienced as a teaching device, something that is in itself false if taken literally, but true in that it is manifested by and in fact inherent in the truth itself, as a means devised skillfully to lead one to the truth, which will turn out to be this principle of truth and half-truth itself fleshed out. But this is only half the story, since it is as true to say the Buddha realm too is merely a provisional upaya, as it is to say the 9 realms are really the ultimately real Buddha realm. In fact, all have to be both at once.